Right then, so thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that bit of crowd and audience participation. But without further ado, I'll hand over to the IAB Chief Economist, Daniel Knapp, for a deep dive into the audio landscape. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for the introduction, and a very good morning, good day to all of you. I would like to provide you just with a whistle-stop tour of the audio landscape as it currently is unfolding in Europe. Ryan rightly highlighted that the market is still quite nascent. We talk about audio a lot, but there's still a gap between the volume of listening and the palpable excitement in the industry and the actual euros, pounds, zlotys, and so forth that are actually being poured into this market. But this is changing rapidly. So we recently released our AdEx benchmark study, which is a meta-analysis of ad spend in 28 European countries. For the first time, we had a consistent picture of the digital audio landscape, which is the first indication, really, that the market is reaching some sense of maturity as local trade bodies start reporting numbers, and numbers that are comparable and consistent. This is already very good news, and that will just help us benchmark and better understand where this market is going to go. We all knew that 2020 was an exceptional year for digital advertising. And we didn't hear so much about audio, probably in the public, as everything was focused on performance channels, on will programmatic rebound, what's the video opportunity, etc. But behind the scenes, in a sense, we saw audio pace ahead with exceptional double-digit growth in a 69.4 billion euro market, growing 6.3% overall in 2020 across 28 European markets. If we just break this out and see where does audio fit among all these different formats, we can see it was doing quite well. It was growing as fast as social, and only the social video subsegment was growing faster than audio. And this is just audio overall. If we break out subsegments in audio, we can actually see that there is further growth happening. Overall, let's factor out social because it's a very different market and look at the overall display market in Europe. So banners, native, video, and also we count, like many national IABs, do audio as part of this display world and see how is it actually performing. And we can see that if we factor out social, audio grew a little bit more, even 16.7%. And it was growing faster than banners, faster than video, but you can see it's just a 500 million euro market, 502 to be precise. So still a far cry from the video revolution and still a far cry from the banner market, but things are changing quite quickly, as I will show you at the end of this presentation. Now, whereas overall audio grew by 16.5%, we can see very different trends within the audio landscape. So if we zoom in the middle of this chart first, we can see that podcast advertising was outperforming advertising around music streaming content by a factor of 4.9. So podcast advertising grew nearly 43% in the pandemic. Overall, we can see podcast advertising increased its share of the total audio opportunity from just below 1/4 to actually above 1/4, with 28.1% of all spend on digital audio now being allocated to podcast. It varies by market. The UK is leading market in this, Sweden is leading market, France, Germany. But then if we look further into south of Europe and also Eastern Europe, we see there's stronger monetization in terms of music. And also we see that in smaller markets, the podcast production costs, etc., are still hindering to scale that opportunity. So overall, we have a podcast market of 141 million euros in Europe and a music streaming market of around 261 million euros. Bear in mind that all these figures do not include non-IP delivery digital radio, right? DVB radio and so forth. This is all not included in these figures. But from the macro picture, let's try to zoom into some other segments. We will talk about programmatic in this session today, and the overall, including audio, the overall programmatic market, as I showed initially, grew by 8.3%, and Europe now is a programmatic first display market, where over 50% of display and video spend is transacted programmatically. Go to the right side and see what's happening in audio. We see programmatic is still a small component of audio, but it's growing rapidly. In the last 2 years, the vast majority of audio was transacted on a manual basis. We saw the programmatic infrastructure come in slowly, mainly in the US, but also I think in Europe, and notably, in particular, some radio sales houses, for instance, in Germany, were building up proprietary functionality. The audio share was quite low. But if we look at it right now on the right side, we could see that within a given year, the audio share, the programmatic share of audio doubled. And we saw a 77.6% increase in terms of programmatic and an 8.9% increase in terms of non-programmatic audio, meaning there's a lot of growth coming now from programmatic and not just anymore from what was mainly, in particular in the podcast space in the past, host-read ads and so forth. So it means that there's more automation coming in, more intermediaries coming in, but it also means that monetization, in particular for niche audiences, for smaller podcasts, for instance, or different types of music, is being monetized better. Digital audio didn't have a bad year in 2020, it only had a bad quarter. Here we can see monthly ad spend trajectory on a year-on-year basis by format in Europe during the pandemic. And we can see that audio took a hit in March, April, and May, but was already recovering in the second quarter, at the end of the second quarter, had decent growth in Q3, and then was outperforming all other digital segments in Q4. This kind of correlates very well with the Spotify quarterly results, which I checked out recently, where we saw really the only quarter that declined was Q2, that was globally, and then I think it was 8.8% growth in Q3 and then double-digit growth in Q4. So the European picture kind of amplified trends that we could see on a global basis. What about different markets? Actually, most markets in Europe posted double-digit growth in digital audio, and France actually nearly grew 100%. If we dive into the French figures, we could see that programmatic in France actually was growing over 400% from a small base, but it was growing rapidly. And we can see there are quite a few markets which are growing, which have been growing above the European average growth of 16.5%. And the remarkable thing is that these are markets that are both mature digital markets, so with high ad spend per capita, but also those which are emerging markets. For instance, Turkey, a market which is moving up the ranks from it's now in the top 10 markets in Europe in terms of size, growing quite strongly. And the only market that was taken a hit was Belarus due to the revolutionary environment there. But then also, if we look at Belgium, I think the measurement issue in particular, as Belgium has a very radio landscape, and this might have affected the digital audio growth as well. We can see that the UK is now the biggest digital audio market in Europe, and this is all converted in 2015 euros. But the UK lead isn't as far as in other formats. So we can see in overall display or video, the UK has a 3x or 3.5x lead to the next market. It's only 2x in this case. And we can see Germany with coming in a very strong second, and also the home of Spotify, Sweden, a fairly small market, but a very digitally mature market, actually taking the third rank. The digital audio share, so which is the share that digital audio has of the overall display segment, is fairly consistent across the majority of markets, where we were an average of 1.6%. And we can see many, in particular, established markets, France, UK, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, Italy, they all fall in that range. And we can see it's mainly CEE markets where this is still underdeveloped. And we have two real outlier markets, Belgium, with the very strong classic radio or audio heritage overall, and also Sweden, the home of Spotify. If we try to cluster these markets and try to organize a little bit where they currently fit, we can see a remarkable picture. So here the size of the bubble represents the size of the market. On the x-axis, digital audio share of display ad spend is an indication of the maturity of the market. And then growth here on the y-axis is a notion of the vibrancy. We can see Sweden really is an outlier market in terms of digital audio, but we can see remarkably that a lot of markets are very similar in their stage of development. So Germany, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Italy, Finland, UK, they're all cluster around a similar spectrum. Now, one thing that happened, I think, which is remarkable to show, is that it's a time to grow digital audio revenues, but it's not necessarily for publishers a time to grow digital audio margins. I'm taking a Spotify example here just because their SEC filings provide a very rich canvas to explore this argument. What you could see is that in 2020, despite healthy revenue gains of around 10% overall in ad-funded audio, Spotify's advertising gross margin decreased so far that it was just below 1%. And that was because costs increased so much. Number one, it was the podcast costs. So this was an investment in the future, adding new content, creating new content. It's the equivalent to Hollywood studios, in a sense, doubling down on production to really capitalize long-term on a trend. So that was a major new investment. But the other things were remarkable. If we look at royalty costs, for instance, and delivery costs, these are all due to a consumption increase as people stayed at home. But consumption grew much faster than ad monetization, meaning the costs grew, but revenues couldn't offset those costs. This is likely going to be corrected in 2021, but it really shows that the audio opportunity is a long game and that investment in content is essential, and it's not the time to talk about margins. But we can see how vibrant the market is because the global M&A landscape in digital audio is accelerating. After an already record 2020, we already have more deals between January and April 2021 than in the entire year of 2020. And if you look at this range here, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the next panels, we can see it's happening across a spectrum of players. It's an entire ecosystem. It's about production. It's about programmatic advertising. It's about podcasting. It's about creator tools, etc., with kind of healthy valuations. And we can see a lot of, if we look at the buyer side, a lot of consolidation happening with Apple, iHeartMedia, Amazon, Spotify, and so forth coming to the fold. Remarkable, I find, is the Tidal acquisition by Square, a payment company, now tapping into the audio opportunity, seeing there are adjacent sectors which are also on non-kind of advertising or media native sectors that are eyeing the audio opportunity. Lastly, let me provide you a little outlook. So we saw consistent growth over the last couple of years to 502 million in terms of ad spend on digital audio in Europe, but it's really just the beginning. And we see strong indications that the audio market is only just on the cusp of taking off. We are confident in conversation with players and analysis of public filings that the growth in streaming hours we've observed during the pandemic will not be reset to pre-pandemic levels in 2021. Listening growth will actually resume. We also see that with ad demand coming back now, the gap between consumption and monetization will shrink. Podcast monetization in particular is going to be improved beyond host-read ads, which made it more kind of artisanal than scalable. That is changing. We're seeing advancements in measurements and metrics, still a lot of work to do. I'm very sure that we'll touch on this topic. And we're seeing some players just are coming in right now. For instance, Amazon monetizing its Alexa devices for kind of an audio platform, and also, of course, potentially connecting the very rich first-party data to audio advertising, allowing it to play very differently in the overall purchase funnel. Lastly, we see the emergence of programmatic in audio as a really good means of connecting audio to the other display media, banner, video, and so forth, so that it isn't being booked and operated as a standalone channel, but can be integrated into an omni-channel strategy. And with those thoughts, I would like to pass back to Ryan, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Fascinating insight into the world and the details of the digital audio market and some of the interesting developments to look out for.